Chapter 4 Executive Introduction. Legislature, executive, and judiciary are three organs of government. Together, they perform the functions of the government, maintain law and order, and look after the welfare of the people. The Constitution ensures that they work in coordination with each other and maintain a balance amongst themselves. In a parliamentary system, executive and the legislature are interdependent. The legislature controls the executive and in turn is controlled by the executive. In this chapter, we shall discuss the composition, structure, and function of the executive organ of the government. This chapter will also tell you about the changes that have occurred in recent times due to political practice. After reading this chapter, you will be able to number 1. Make a distinction between the parliamentary and presidential executive. Number 2. Understand the constitutional position of the President of India. Number 3. Know the composition and functioning of the Council of Ministers and the importance of the Prime Minister. And number 4. Understand the importance and functioning of the administrative machinery. What is an executive? Who is in charge of the administration of your school? Who takes important decisions in a school or a university? In any organization, some office holder has to take the decisions and implement those decisions. We call this activity administration or management. But administration requires a body at the top that will take policy decisions or the big decisions and supervise and coordinate the routine administrative functioning. You may have heard about the executives of big companies, banks, or industrial units. Every formal group has a body of those who function as the chief administrators or the executives of that organization. Some office holders decide the policies and rules and regulations, and then some office holders implement those decisions in actual day-to-day functioning of the organization. The word executive means a body of persons that look after the implementation of the rules and regulations in actual practice. In the case of government also, one body may take policy decisions and decide about rules and regulations, while the other one would be in charge of implementing those rules. The organ of government that primarily looks after the function of implementation and administration is called the executive. What are the principal functions of the executive? Executive is the branch of government responsible for the implementation of laws and policies adopted by legislature. The executive is often involved in framing of policy. The official designations of the executive vary from country to country. Some countries have presidents while others have chancellors. The executive branch is not just about presidents, prime ministers, and ministers. It also extends to the administrative machinery, while the heads of government and the ministers saddled with the overall responsibility of government policy are together known as political executive. Those responsible for day-to-day administration are called the permanent executive. What are the different types of executive? Every country may not have heard the same type of executive. You may have heard about the President of the USA and Queen of England, but the powers and functions of Presidents of the USA are very different from the powers of the President of India. Similarly, the powers of the Queen of England are different from the powers of the King of Bhutan. Both India and France have prime ministers, but their roles are different from each other. Why is this so? To answer this question, we will briefly outline the nature of executive existing in some of these countries. The USA has a presidential system and executive powers are in the hands of the president. Canada has a parliamentary democracy with a constitutional monarchy where Queen Elizabeth II is the formal chief of state and the prime minister is the head of the government. In France, both the president and the prime minister are a part of the semi-presidential system. The president appoints the prime minister as well as the ministers but cannot dismiss them as they are responsible to the parliament. Japan has a parliamentary system with the emperor as the head of the state and the prime minister as the head of the government. Italy has a parliamentary system with the president as the formal head of state and the prime minister as the head of the government. Russia has a semi-presidential system where president is the head of state and prime minister, who is appointed by the president, is the head of the government. Germany has a parliamentary system in which the president is the ceremonial head of state and the chancellor in the head of government. In a presidential system, the president is the head of state as well as head of government. In this system, the office of president is very powerful, both in theory and practice. Countries with such a system include the United States, Brazil, and most nations in Latin America. In a parliamentary system, the prime minister is the head of the government. Most parliamentary systems have a president or a monarch who is the nominal head of state. In such a system, the role of president or monarch is primarily ceremonial and prime minister along with the cabinet wields effective power. Countries with such system include Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, as well as Portugal. A semi-presidential system has both a president and a prime minister, but unlike the parliamentary system, the president may possess significant day-to-day powers. In this system, it is possible that sometimes the president and prime minister may belong to the same party, and at times they may belong to two different parties, and thus would be opposed to each other. Countries with such a system include France, Russia, Sri Lanka, etc. Parliamentary executive in India. When the Constitution of India was written, India already had some experience of running the parliamentary system under the Acts of 1919 and 1935. This experience had shown that in the parliamentary system, the executive can be effectively controlled by the representatives of the people. The makers of the Indian Constitution wanted to ensure that the government would be sensitive to public expectations and would be responsible and accountable. The other alternative to the parliamentary executive was the presidential form of government, but the presidential executive puts much emphasis on the president as the chief executive and as source of all executive power. There is always the danger of personality cult in presidential executive. The makers of the Indian Constitution wanted a government that would have a strong executive branch, but at the same time, enough safeguards should be there to check against the personality cult. In the parliamentary form, there are many mechanisms that ensure that the executive would be answerable and to be controlled by the legislature or people's representatives. So the Constitution adopted the parliamentary system of executive for the governments both as national and at the state levels. According to this system, there is a president who is the formal head of state of India and the prime minister and the council of ministers which run the government at the national level. At the state level, the executive comprises the governor and the chief minister and councils of ministers. The Constitution of India vests the executive power of the Union formally in the President. In reality, the President exercises these powers through the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister. The President is elected for a period of 5 years, but there is no direct election by the people of the office of President. The President is elected indirectly. This means that the President is elected not by the ordinary citizens, but by the elected MLAs and MPs. This decision or election takes place in accordance with the principle of proportional representation with single transferable vote. The President can be removed from office only by Parliament by following the procedure of impeachment. This procedure requires a special majority as explained in the last chapter. The only ground for impeachment is the violation of the Constitution. Article 74(1) says that there shall be a council of ministers with the Prime Minister at the head to aid and advise the President, who shall, in the exercise of his functions, act in accordance with such advice. Provided that the President may require the Council of Ministers to reconsider such advice, and the President shall act in accordance with the advice tendered after such reconsideration. Do you know what the word shall means here? It indicates that the advice is binding to or on the President. In view of the controversy about the scope of President's powers, a specific mention was made in the Constitution by an amendment that the advice of the Council of Ministers will be binding on the President. By another amendment made later, it was decided that the President can ask a Council of Ministers to reconsider its advice but has to accept the reconsidered advice to the Council of Ministers. We have already seen that the President is the formal head of the government. In this formal sense, the President has wide-ranging executive, legislative, judicial and emergency powers. In a parliamentary system, these powers are in reality used by the President only on the advice of the Council of Ministers. The Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers have support of the majority in the Lok Sabha, and they are real executive. In most of the cases, the President has to follow the advice of the Council of Ministers. We do not give him any real power, but we have made his position one of authority and dignity. The Constitution wants to create neither a real executive nor a mere figurehead, but a head that neither reigns nor governs. It wants to create a great figurehead. Said by Jawaharlal Nehru. Discretionary powers of the President. On the basis of the above discussion, can we infer that the President has no discretionary power under any circumstances? This will be an incorrect assessment. Constitutionally, the President has a right to be informed of all important matters and deliberations of the Council of Ministers. The Prime Minister is obliged to furnish all the information that the President may call for. The President often writes to the Prime Minister and expresses his views on matters confronting the country. Besides this, there are at least 3 situations where the President can exercise the powers using his or her own discretion. In the first place, we have already noted that the President can send back the advice given by the Council of Ministers and ask the Council to reconsider the decision. In doing this, the President acts on his or her own discretion. When the President thinks that the advice has certain flaws or legal lacunae, or that it is not in the best interest of the country, the President can ask the Council to reconsider the decision, although the Council can still send the same advice and the President would then be bound by that advice. Such a request by the President to reconsider the decision would naturally carry a lot of weight. So this is one way in which the President can act in his own discretion. Secondly, the President also has veto power by which he can withhold or refuse to give assent to bills passed by the Parliament. Every bill passed by the Parliament goes to the President for his assent before it becomes a law. The President can send the bill back to the Parliament asking it to reconsider the bill. This veto power is limited because if the Parliament passes the same bill again and sends it back to the President, then the President has to give assent to the bill. However, there is no mention in the Constitution about the time limit within which the President must send the bill back for reconsideration. This means that the President can just keep the bill pending with him without any time limit. This gives the President an informal power to use the veto in a very effective manner. This is sometimes referred to as pocket veto. Then the third kind of discretion arises more out of political circumstances. Formally, the President appoints the Prime Minister. Normally in the parliamentary system, a leader who has the support of all majority in the Lok Sabha would be appointed as Prime Minister and the question of discretion would not arise. But imagine a situation when after an election no leader has a clear majority in the Lok Sabha. Imagine further that after attempts to forge alliances, 2 or 3 leaders are claiming that they have the support of the majority in the House. Now the President has to decide whom to appoint as the President. In such a situation, the President has to use his own discretion in judging who really have the support of the majority or who can actually form and run the government. Since 1989, major political changes have considerably increased the importance of the presidential office. In the 4 parliamentary elections held from 1989 to 1998, no single party or coalition attained a majority in the Lok Sabha. These situations demanded presidential intervention either in order to constitute governments or to grant a request for dissolution of Lok Sabha by a Prime Minister who could not prove majority in the House. It may thus be said that the presidential discretion is related to political conditions. There is greater scope for presidential assertiveness when governments are not stable and coalitions occupy power. For the most part, the president is a formal power holder and a ceremonial head of nation. You may wonder, why then do we need a president? In a parliamentary system, the Council of Ministers is dependent on the support of the majority in the legislature. This also means that the Council of Ministers may be removed at any time, and a new Council of Ministers will have to be put up in place. Such a situation requires a head of the state who has a fixed term. Such a situation who may be empowered to appoint the Prime Minister and who may be symbolically represent the entire country. This is exactly the role of President in ordinary circumstances. Besides, when no party has a clear majority, the President has an additional responsibility of making a choice and appointing the Prime Minister to run the government or the country. The Vice President of India. The Vice President of India is elected for 5 years. His election method is similar to that of the President. The only difference is that members of state legislatures are not part of the electoral college. The Vice President may be removed from his office by resolution of the Rajya Sabha passed by a majority and agreed to by the Lok Sabha. The Vice President acts as the ex officio chairman of the Rajya Sabha and takes over the office of President, and there is a vacancy by reasons of death, resignation, removal by impeachment, or otherwise. The Vice President acts as the President only until a new President is elected. B.D. Jatti acted as President on the death of Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed until a new President was elected. Prime Minister and Council of Ministers. No discussion of government or politics in India would normally take place without mentioning one office, the Prime Minister of India. Can you imagine why this is so? We have already seen earlier in this chapter that the President exercises his powers only on the advice of Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers is headed by the Prime Minister. Therefore, as head of the Council of Ministers, the position becomes the most important functionary of the government in our country. In the parliamentary form of executive, it is essential that the Prime Minister has the support of the majority in the Lok Sabha. This support by the majority also makes the Prime Minister very powerful. The moment this support of the majority is lost, the Prime Minister loses the office. For many years after independence, the Congress Party had the majority of the Lok Sabha and its leader would become the Prime Minister. Since 1989, there would have been many occasions when no party had majority in the Lok Sabha. Various political parties have come together and formed a coalition that has majority in the House. In such situations, a leader who is acceptable to most partners of the coalition becomes the Prime Minister. Formally, a leader who has the support of the majority is appointed by the President as Prime Minister. The Prime Minister then decides who will be the ministers in the Council of Ministers. The Prime Minister allocates ranks and portfolios to the ministers. Depending upon the seniority and political importance, the ministers are given ranks of Cabinet Minister, Minister of State, or Deputy Minister. In the same manner, chief ministers of the states choose ministers from their own party or coalition. The Prime Minister and all the ministers have to be members of the Parliament. If someone becomes a minister or Prime Minister without being an MP, such a person has to get elected to the Parliament within 6 months. In the chapter of the Legislature, you will study in detail the various mechanisms through which the Parliament controls the executive. But remember that the most important feature of parliamentary executive is that the executive is routinely under the control and supervision of the legislature. The Council of Ministers is collectively responsible to the Lok Sabha. This provision means that a ministry which loses confidence of the Lok Sabha is obliged to resign. The principle indicates that the ministry is an executive committee of the Parliament and it collectively governs on behalf of the Parliament. Collective responsibility is based on the principle of solidarity of the cabinet. It implies that a vote of no confidence, even against a single minister, leads to resignation of the entire Council of Ministers. It also indicates that if a minister does not agree with a policy or decision of the cabinet, he or she must either accept the decision or resign. It is binding on all ministers to pursue or agree to a policy for which there is collective responsibility. In India, the Prime Minister enjoys a preeminent place in the government. The Council of Ministers cannot exist without the Prime Minister. The Council becomes into existence only after the Prime Minister has taken the oath of office. The death or resignation of the Prime Minister automatically brings about the dissolution of the Council of Ministers, but the demise, dismissal, or resignation of a minister only creates a ministerial vacancy. The Prime Minister acts as a link between the Council of Ministers on the other hand and the President, as well as the Parliament on the other hand. It is this role that the Prime Minister which led Pandit Nehru to describe him as the linchpin of the government. It is also the constitutional obligation of the Prime Minister to communicate to the President all decisions of the Council of Ministers relating to the administration of the affairs of the Union and proposals of legislations. The Prime Minister is involved in all crucial decisions of all government and decides on the policies of the government. Thus, the power wielded by the Prime Minister flows from various sources: control over the Council of Ministers, leadership of the Lok Sabha, command over the bureaucratic machine, access to media, projection of personalities during elections, projection as national leader during international summitry, as well as foreign visits. However, the power which the Prime Minister wields and actually puts into use depends upon the prevailing political conditions. The position of the Prime Minister and Council of Ministers has been unassailable whenever a single political party has secured majority in the Lok Sabha. However, this has not been the case when governments have been led by coalitions of political parties. Since 1989, we have witnessed many coalition governments in India. Many of these governments could not remain in power for the full term of the Lok Sabha. They were either removed or they resigned due to loss of support of a majority. These developments have affected the working of the parliamentary executive. In the first place, these developments have resulted in the growing discretionary role of the President in the selection of Prime Ministers. Secondly, the coalition nature of Indian politics in this period has necessitated much more consultation between political partners, leading to erosion of prime ministerial authority. Thirdly, it has also brought restrictions on various prerogatives of the Prime Minister, like choosing the ministers and then deciding their ranks and portfolios. Fourthly, even the policies and the programs of the government cannot be decided by the Prime Minister alone. Political parties of different ideologies came together both as pre-poll and post-poll allies to form a government. Policies are framed after a lot of negotiations and compromises among the allies. In this entire process, the Prime Minister has to act more as a negotiator than as leader of the government. At the state level, a Prime Minister or a similar parliamentary executive exists, though with some variations. The most important variation is that there is a governor of the state appointed by the President. Though the Chief Minister, like the Prime Minister, is the leader of the majority party in the Assembly, the governor has more discretionary powers. However, the main principles of parliamentary system operate at the state level too. Permanent executive bureaucracy. Who implements the decisions of the ministers? The executive organ of the government includes the Prime Minister, the ministers, and a large organization called the bureaucracy or the administrative machinery. To underline the difference between this machinery and the military service, it is described as civil service. Trained and skilled officers who work as permanent employees of the government are assigned to the task of assisting the ministers in formulating policies and implementing these policies. In a democracy, the elected representatives and the ministers are in charge of government, and the administration is under their control and supervision. In the parliamentary system, the legislature also exercise control over the administration. The administrative officers cannot act in violation on the policies adopted by the legislature. It is the responsibility of the ministers to retain political control over the administration. India has established professional administrative machinery. At the same time, this machinery is made politically accountable. The bureaucracy is also expected to be politically neutral. This means that the bureaucracy will not take any political position on policy matters. In a democracy, it is always possible that a party is defeated in elections and the new government want to offer new policies in the place of policies of the previous government. In such a situation, it is the responsibility of administrative machinery to faithfully and efficiently participate in drafting the policy and its implementation. The Indian bureaucracy today is an enormously complex system. It consists of all India services, state services, employees to the local governments, and the technical and managerial staff running public sector undertakings. Makers of our constitution were aware of the importance of the non-partisan and the professional bureaucracy. They also wanted the members of the civil services or the bureaucracy to be impartially selected on basis of the merit. So the UPSC has been entrusted with the task of conducting the process of recruitment of civil servants for the Government of India. Similar public service commissions are provided for the states also. Members of the Public Service Commissions are appointed for a fixed term. The removal or suspension is subject to a thorough inquiry made by a judge of the Supreme Court. While efficiency and merit are the norms of recruitment, the Constitution also ensures that all sections of the society, including the weaker sections, have an opportunity to be part of the public bureaucracy. For this purpose, the Constitution has provided for reservation of jobs for the Dalits and Adivasis. Subsequently, reservations have also been provided for women and other backward classes. These provisions ensure that the bureaucracy would be more representative and social inequalities will not come in the way of recruitment to the civil service. Persons selected by the UPSC for Indian Administrative Services and Indian Police Service constitute the backbone of the higher level bureaucracy in the states. You may know the collector of a district is the most important officer of the government at the district level. Do you know that the collector is normally an IAS officer and that the officer is governed by the service conditions laid down by the central government? An IAS or IPS officer is assigned to a particular state where he or she works under the supervision of the state government. However, the IAS or IPS are appointed by the central government. They can go back into service of the central government, and most importantly, only the central government can take disciplinary action against them. This means that the key administrative officers of the states are under the supervision and control of the central government. Apart from the IAS and the IPS officers appointed by the UPSC, the administration of the state is looked after by officers appointed through the SPSCs. As we shall study later in this chapter on federalism, the feature of bureaucracy strengthens the control of the central government over the administration of the states. The bureaucracy is an important instrument through which welfare policies of the government must reach to the people. But most often it is so powerful that the people are afraid of approaching the government officer. It is a common experience of the people that bureaucracy is insensitive to the demands and expectations of the ordinary citizen. Only if the democratically elected government controls the bureaucracy, some of these problems can be effectively handled. On the other hand, too much political interference turns the bureaucracy into an instrument in the hands of the politician. Though the Constitution has created independent machinery for recruitment, many people think that there is no provision for protecting the civil servants from political interference in the performance of their duties. It is also felt that enough provisions are not there to ensure the accountability of the bureaucracy to the citizens. There is an expectation that measures like the right to information they make the bureaucracy a little more responsive and accountable. Conclusion. The modern executive is a very powerful institution of the government. The executive enjoys greater powers compared to other organs of the government. This generates a greater need to have democratic control over the executive. The makers of our constitution thought with foresight that the executive must be put simply under the regular supervision and control. Thus, a parliamentary executive was chosen. Periodic elections, constitutional limits over the exercise powers, and democratic politics have ensured that executive organ can become unresponsive.